first speaker is a writer, an educator, a futurist, and he has one of the coolest subtitles, most elegant subtitles on his website, working to bring a greater sense of sanity and justice to education. I'd like to introduce the one and only Zak Stein.
Hey, thank you, Robert. Lean, good to be here again. I love this event. I love that it started Bildung, and now that it's about the equinox, and the equinox, of course, being something that has to do with the position of the Earth in the solar system, rather than a obscure Germanic word. But still, the sentiment is the same, which is what do we all have in common, and how do we become human? And so it's an honor again to speak here. Yeah, Lean sent me the paper A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. I forget when, some time ago before this, and I agreed to speak to it. And I'm not going to recapitulate it because you can read it. But what was interesting to me when I received it was that, I went to a graduate school of education in part because I wanted to be interdisciplinary, and I saw that education, you had to reform everything if you wanted to reform education. And so in my second book, I write about that. I write about these social miracles. I say, listen, you focus on schools, but you could fix the school and it's still in the neighborhood, and the parents are still who they are, and the food system's still what it is, and the entertainment's still what it is, and the labor market. So I had these 12 social miracles, which were basically about the need to reboot at the level of at least a city, if not at the scale of something larger that would be like a region, or let alone something like a civilization. And so this notion of the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, touching on all these points that are actually at the level of civilization itself, but pointing to what's the condition for the possibility of education? Like, how could we actually do it? Meaning Bildung, not as a under laborer for the market or an under laborer for geopolitical social trap, like education was during the Cold War. Like, how could we really do it? What would that look like? It would look like something very different. And so the question is, how deep are the changes that need to occur to allow for real education to occur, which means for humanity to kind of to explore reality in itself in the process of intergenerational transmission, to keep this thing going. And the alphabet's an interesting place to start, actually, because A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H is, of course, phonetic alphabet. And the ideographic alphabets are different. And this is a very important thing when we're thinking about global unity. We have to think about where the fundamental bases of important differences that need to be maintained reside. And long, I'm talking thousands, millennia ago, there was a very fundamental distinction at the root of the civilizational stack, and it was the difference between these Phoenician alphabets and the ideographical alphabets. And so then you get this long history of continuity of Chinese civilization, for example, contrasted with this very different, relatively Johnny-come-lately kind of Western, especially American hegemony of a specific kind of Phoenician alphabet. And the Phoenician alphabets, of course, come from Phoenicia, which the Phoenicians were traders. They had the spruce trees that didn't grow barnacles and such, and so they could travel all over. And so they needed a way to kind of translate and make contracts across very different languages. So they needed to be able to sound out these different languages and make contracts that were legible. So there was this kind of like trade-based, as opposed to very different contexts in which the ideographic alphabets emerged, where you're organizing, very large populations around fragile crops of rice, for example. And so just pointing to, yes, please, one world, but not some homogeny. There needs to be synchrony, like the brain. Think about the brain. If your brain is actually in one harmony, you're probably having a seizure. Like, the brain's actually in opponent processing based on functional differentiation, which means harmony from unity, which means synchrony. So when we think about global civilization, and think about one humanity, we have to think about that. What we call at the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, these kind of like universal grammars of value, which allow for uniqueness, like grammars do. Because if you end up with a homogenistic, kind of like dictated alphabetic disruption of thought, which is what eventually the kind of like metropolitan broadcasting of the American hegemon did with its alphabet, with its A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And so we have to think about this kind of like broadening that notion. And one of the first people to do this, well, let me go back to alphabets. So there's also these calendars and measurement systems. That's another thing I've focused on a lot, is calendrical and metrological injustices, scheduling. So it's notable that there is not really a holiday today in America. There totally used to be. Like most of the ancient cultures would have had, we wouldn't have been doing this today. We would have been doing something else today. But very specific calendrical psyop, if you will, long ago perpetrated with the Gregorian calendar of most note, has displaced humanity from its cosmic rhythms. So I would argue that some alphabetical innovations and certainly some directions we could take at AI could further disrupt our ability in terms of the things that mediate between us and reality and the things that disrupt our contact to reality. So the turning of phenomenological time into calendar time took place long ago. All right, so but to the point, forgive me. So Comenius, John Amos Comenius, I don't know how many minutes I have left, but he was one of the first people who was trying to articulate something like a universal grammar of value, which is to say, how do we, during a time between worlds, in his context, the 30 Years' War, the end of the feudal empire, the beginning of this thing, the Enlightenment, the beginning of Dutch East India Company, Royal Society, all of that, he was part of that transition. But his question was very deep. It was basically like, geez Louise, like we're discovering that the world is a very big place. Like this whole experiment of European civilization is quite precarious. They're fighting wars over the Eucharist, while at the same time beginning what we would now call science. How do we get millions and millions of people who are now in a state of disruption and famine into a state where everyone's reading? No one believes in the divine right of kings anymore. No one believes in the feudal taxation system anymore. We are running printing press enabled bureaucracies that extract capital rather than divinely sanctioned rackets that extract taxes. It was a very, very fundamentally different kind of setup. And Comenius believed education was foundational to that. Now, Comenius's ideas were, I would say, stripped of their context. But at the base of the stack of when we think about Bildung and the base of the stack of what brought us contemporary civilization in its current form, it was this Comenian innovation in the universalization of education. And this is where I'll stop. So the question of what does a new non-foundationalist universalism look like? Remember, it was like, I forget, it's like 85, where it was like, we are the world. Remember that? It was like naive 90s, kind of like universalism. That sucks that we're cynical about that. Like what's a non-naive, non-foundationalist universalism, like a universal grammar of value? It's non-hegemistic or hegemonic or whatever the word would be. It's hard to say that word because it's so misused, but it's like, what does that look like? It's certainly not Facebook and the like, which is claiming to usher in democracy, right? It's certainly not OpenAI, which is confusing us about teacherly authority. So that's a question I leave us with. That's a question about humanity and the possibility of a new humanism being like humans. Okay, we all have something in common. And the task of coupling the energies of youth, coupling the energy of young people to this project of civilization. How do we justify doing that? How do we argue with them about giving their time to this project of cooperating in the interest of everyone? And we've run out of ideological fumes. So yeah, this question of a new humanism, I think, is important. And yeah, I'll pass the mic.